Hello everyone, this is BritSimon. I want to talk to you today about the public charge concerns and how to avoid getting denied in your DV lottery case. Let's talk about that. Okay, this is an important subject. I have seen cases denied over this, I've seen cases delayed, and especially towards the end of the year, a delay on your case can be extremely serious. It can cost you your green card. So please, let's take this subject seriously. Try and stay as far as you can into the video. I'm going to go over a number of topics on the video. I'm going to explain what is public charge. I'm going to explain how you can overcome concerns about that. I'm going to talk about the I-134, which is an affidavit of support. And at the end, I'll show you how to fill out the I-134 and explain a little bit more about that. So please stay tuned throughout the whole video. Okay, so what is this public charge thing? Recently, there's been some changes by the Trump administration that talked about public charge. But actually, that's not so much of an impact to DV Lottery, and this public charge concern has always been a part of the DV Lottery system. It's always been part of standard immigration law. So it's important to just go through this with that mindset. So firstly, every immigration case, with a very few exceptions, such as asylum, etc., has to meet the public charge criteria. The applicant must satisfy the consular officer that they will not become a public charge if that applicant is allowed to emigrate into America. The factors for the CO to make this determination are fairly flexible, and so that will vary across embassies, across the COs, and even vary case by case. So you may have known someone last week that wasn't asked about public charge concerns, and this week you could be. So regardless of whether you think it'll be asked of you, it's important that you prepare just in case. Cases can be delayed or refused, as I mentioned earlier, if this concern is not satisfied. So, as I mentioned, please do take this one seriously. I should probably explain, by the way, public charge itself. We're talking about public charge. What does it mean? It's a suspicion or assumption that the applicant will require public assistance when they emigrate to the USA. So in other words, it's a concern about finances, essentially. If somebody had plenty of money and was emigrating to the USA, public charge would not be a concern. But unless they have lots of money or things I'm going to explain, then the CO is bound to assess whether that person is going to become a public charge or not. Okay. So let's talk about the factors that may cause a CO to have concerns about the applicant being a public charge. So exceptionally old or young applicants. So let me just address that. It can be to anybody. It doesn't mean if you're 30 years old you have no problems. But if you're a very young person, let's say you're right at the beginning of your life, you're as young as it can get and still go through this process, the DV lottery process. If you're 17 or 18 and you're a DV principal applicant, perhaps you're so young that you've had no experience, you're fresh out of school, perhaps it's unsure whether you can survive, whether you can make it in the USA. Conversely, if you're exceptionally old, let's say you're in your late 50s, 60s, 70s, if you're of that age and you're emigrating to the USA, then you're going to have some concerns about how you're going to make a living, pay for healthcare, those sort of things, right? And so those factors for extremely old people or older people, such as myself, frankly, would be more of a concern in that case. Okay, so that's one factor. It's not the whole factor. Don't think that just because you're not very young or you're not very old that you have no problem. It can be at any point, but these are factors that can increase the concern. People with low education standards or without a strong employment history. So, if you've got a very good track record of going from good job to good job to good job with very little unemployment in between, or if you've got a good education, bachelor's degree, master's degree, something like that, then that could be a strong factor in your favor. Conversely, if you've got little education or no employment history, and really that looks unusual. Let's say you're 27 years old, you left school 7 years ago, 6 years ago, or something, and since then you've never worked, and you just have no idea how to get through life. That could indicate that you could become a public charge in the USA. People who have no family or friends to help them in the USA are more of a concern. If you have friends, if you have family network, or if you have potential, job offers, that sort of thing, contacts in the USA, then those things can help you in getting to the USA and help you satisfy the CO that you won't be a public charge. There have been people with health issues that could affect their ability to work. So I've mentioned this before in a previous video where we talk about the medical that is required before the case, before the interview. At that medical, if there are factors that would affect your ability to work, the physician is required to inform the embassy of those factors. And what that means is people with habitual drug use, for example. Habitual drug use for you is not a concern necessarily in terms of hurting other people, but it might mean that you're unable to support yourself, make a living, and support yourself because you're on drugs, you need a lot of money to feed your drug habit, and so on and so forth. So that can be a factor. Or some sort of physical disability that would somehow affect your ability to work. Now, those two things, being a drug user or having a disablement, are not in themselves factors for denial, but they can lead to a concern about public charge. Okay, so those are things. If you're not sure, if you have some sort of something to discuss, you want to ask, would that be an issue? Feel free to ask me in the comments below or on my blog. Generally speaking, we're not talking about if you've got tattoos or if you wear glasses or something trivial like that. We're talking about serious medical conditions or serious drug use. Right? So we're not just talking about you smoked a joint last month. That's not the sort of thing that's going to be a problem unless the physician is convinced that you're a habitual drug user and therefore will just not be able to work. People who've got no evidence to show a sensible plan for moving to the USA, I've listed this one because if you really have no idea what it's going to take to move to the USA, if you are not considering how difficult that's going to be, then a CO could judge that, frankly, you're not serious and therefore could become a public charge for that reason. This is a case-by-case assessment by the CO. They assess the case in front of them based on multiple factors. No one factor is going to cause their decision 100% one way or the other. So they will take into account what's called a totality of circumstances, or in other words, they're going to look at all the factors and assess that. And it's a subjective assessment by the CO. So you can't appeal that assessment. You need to demonstrate properly, preferably in your first interview, the one and only interview, that you're not going to be a public charge. Okay, so take this seriously, please. Okay, next slide. So how can you reduce the concern of becoming a public charge? Well, there are sort of three broad areas that you can do this. The first is to show your own personal savings. This is a subjective measure. In other words, you'd need to show enough money. But the problem is that the definition of enough is not written in law anywhere. So one CO might consider that $10,000 per person is enough. The next CO could say, no, $20,000 per person is what you need. And I've known embassies, excuse me, I've known embassies ask for as much as $100,000 for a small family. They're not asking you to give them that money, but just demonstrate that you have savings in a bank, probably over a 2 or 3 month period of time, bank statement showing that you have that money. Okay. Now, if you are gifted that money by a family member, that's fine, as long as you show that that's been in your account for a couple of months, and preferably have a letter from your family member saying that this is a gift, a non-returnable, non-refundable gift, not a loan. And explain that it's to help you with your move to the USA. Okay, so that's one way that you might be able to satisfy the public charge. This savings method does not include what I call non-liquid assets. Non-liquid assets are assets or things that you own that might have a value but cannot immediately be sold for cash to raise money, right? So you can't sell a house overnight. You can't sell a car necessarily overnight. It doesn't matter how many camels you've got or what jewelry you've got. Those things are not liquid assets and therefore cannot be taken into account for the public charge concern. Okay? So that's personal savings. That's your own savings you demonstrate through showing financials, things like bank statements at the interview when you go for your interview. Next way is to have a job offer, essentially, from an American employer. Again, this is subjective. It's a subjective thing for the CO to say, does he believe that you're really going to get this job offer or that you have this job offer, and whether the job itself is going to be a realistic income for you. I absolutely want to stress this. I've had people in the past that have thought, oh, I know, I'll get a friend of mine to write on some scrap of paper some job offer saying that they're going to employ me as a driver or whatever, and it's nonsense. It's just something they're making it up, right? The COs are not stupid. They're going to see through that in a heartbeat, and you will end up destroying your own case because you've been dishonest. Okay, so do not ever lie about this or any other aspect of the DV lottery process. If you have ongoing income from investments or continuing business interests, that might also be a possibility. So in other words, let's say you run some sort of business online and that business is going to continue even though you move to the USA. Perhaps you've been consulting or as a web designer or something from your home country, and when you move over to the USA, you'll be able to continue that. So that would be a real possibility. And if you are, if you're known to a US employer, perhaps you've worked in the US before, or you're a very niche sort of employee that you can get a job pretty easily. Those are all things that you can explain in the interview. But again, this is very much subjective. So if you want a non-subjective way to be sure that you can pass the interview and not be a concern for public charge, the very best way that you can do this is getting an I-134, which is an affidavit of support from a friend or family member. Okay, it needs to satisfy certain requirements. I'll go through the I-134 form, but it needs to satisfy certain requirements. Okay, so the income of the sponsor, this is a person in America. The income of the sponsor must be at least 100% of the federal poverty guidelines for the combined family size. And what I mean by that is, let's say you have a sponsor who is married and has 2 children. They have 4 in their family. Let's say yourself, you have a spouse and a child, so there's 3 in your family. The combined family size needs to be 7, considered as 7, 4 for the sponsor, 3 for your family. And the sponsor must be able to support, according to the federal poverty guidelines, a family of 7 at 100% of the FPG. Okay, So that's what that combined family size means. DV cases only use the I-134. There's another form in use for family-sponsored cases, employment-sponsored cases, etc. That's the I-864. There are fundamental differences between the two forms. The biggest one is that the I-864 is financially enforceable, so that the government can chase the sponsor for money if the applicant moves to America and then uses public assistance. That is not the case for the I-134. There is no enforceability with the I-134, although like any government form, if you commit perjury on that form, that would be a problem, but it's not financially enforceable. Okay, so let me just talk about some questions I'm constantly asked about the I-134. The form should be filled out by a US resident or a citizen, not someone on a temporary visa, but someone who is permanently living in the USA and is paying tax in the USA. So that's a US citizen or permanent resident. And there should be some relationship to the applicants. In other words, a complete stranger giving you an I-134 has no strength. There's no belief, there's no reason to believe that this stranger is going to support you in any way, whether it's financial or any other way. So you weaken and probably destroy your case if you present an I-134 that is from someone you don't really know. It should be a family member, ideally. Failing that, it should be a friend, someone you know in the USA. And failing that, it could be a friend of a family member or a friend of a friend, let's say. But someone with a fairly close relationship. And if I were you, I would certainly discuss this closely with that person and make sure that they are aware of the requirements and are prepared to give you the necessary information. I'll go over the supporting documents in a minute. You only need one form per case. So in the scenario I described earlier, where you have a husband and wife and two children who are the sponsoring family, you would only need one form from that family, and it covers the principal and all the family members. In fact, all of your derivatives will be listed on the form. Okay, you cannot split, you cannot share the I-134. It can't be split between two weak sponsors. So if you have two people, neither of whom meet the financial requirements, combining those is useless. That's just two people who are no good to you. It doesn't mean that they somehow can combine their income and overcome the financial requirements, right? So you only have one form from one sponsor, and it covers all of your family one time, right? So the form itself can be scanned and emailed to you. That's fine. The supporting documents also can be scanned and emailed to you. It doesn't have to be sent by post. You're going to take the I-134 and the supporting documents from the sponsor, and you'll take them to the interview. You'll present those documents if requested. So if you're not asked for this form, you don't have to provide it. But if the CO asks for evidence about how you're going to sponsor yourself or look after yourself rather, that's the time when you would pull out the I-134 and the supporting documents. And generally speaking, an I-134 is a black and white thing to decide whether it's going to meet or not meet the requirements. If this is someone you know and their income meets the requirements, then you're golden. You've got no problem. The form doesn't need to be notarized or signed off or submitted to USCIS or anything like that prior to sending to you. No problem at all there. And as I mentioned earlier, the I-134 is technically not enforceable by the US government. My source for that is the US government's own information. Okay, so I know that for a fact that they consider it to be not enforceable, and specifically they use it for DV lottery cases for that reason, because DV lottery cases are self-sponsoring. In terms of immigration law, but they still need to satisfy this public charge concern. Supporting documents. uh, along with the I-134 itself, the sponsor should provide tax information, which is a 1040, which is a tax return document, or a W-2, which is an annual form that is provided to employees in the USA from employers showing how much money that employee has earned during the year and how much tax they've paid, etc. So the 1040 or the W-2 are similar sort of documents. The 1040 is more applicable in cases where the person sponsoring you is perhaps running their own business. But in any case, we're now, middle of 2019. The only 1040 or W-2 that someone would have available is from the earlier part of this year, related to income from 2018, right? So in order to bring that up to date, you also need to provide pay slips from the sponsor, which is recent payroll information, so showing how much they've been earning recently, okay, and making sure that they're still meeting the federal poverty guideline. And then also government issued photo ID from the sponsor, so a passport, state driving license, that sort of thing. Those are the documents that you'll need. Okay. So that's the frequently asked questions about the I-134. I hope I've addressed all of them, because I get lots and lots of questions about this subject. So I'm hoping I'm sort of heading off those here. Okay. Let me just talk about the recent public charge changes. Has there been a change that affects DV cases? This is a question that's gone back and forth amongst people. As I mentioned earlier, DV cases have always had to meet the public charge concerns. That's not changed. That bit of it has not changed. But the public charge assessment in law is changing at the moment to increase the number of public assistance programs that will be taken into account to decide whether someone has accessed public assistance or not. Who does that affect most of all? Well, it mostly affects people who have been in the USA on some temporary visa, a working visa, or a student visa, something like that, and are now wanting to transfer and become an immigrant and transfer to a green card, right? And so they go through a process called adjustment of status. During that process, they will be asked whether they've accessed public assistance programs, and now, since the rule change, that's more onerous, more it's more wide scope. There's a wider scope of public assistance programs that could be taken into account. Okay, so that's the biggest impact. There are some other impacts, but generally speaking, for consular processing, which is CP, as I've got on the screen here, consular processing, if you've never been to the USA, or you've been there but you never accessed public assistance programs, then you have no real concerns from the recent changes, but you do need to meet the public charge requirements that are laid out. Okay. Generally speaking, though, I would say that this government under Trump obviously are anti-immigration, anti-intelligence as well, but they are pushing more and more towards things that will stop immigrants coming to the country, and so they're raising the bar. They're broadening the scope of these anti-immigration policies, and so it's ideal to make sure that you really take account of this. Okay, so let me now. I'm going to do a couple of things. Firstly, I'm going to address a concern that people raise about whether this is really part of the DV lottery program. I'll show you that website that shows that it was already made known to you, and then I'll go through the I-134 form itself. I'll show you where to get that in a few moments here, and go through how that would be filled out for anyone that needs to see that. Okay. Okay, so first of all, I've got the DV 2020 instructions for the Diversity Immigrant Visa Program. I'm looking at the most recent one here, but this has really been unchanged. This rule I'm about to show you has been unchanged for many years. I could show you the where this is written in law about the public charge concern, and specifically about the DV lottery. But without getting too technical, I can demonstrate to you exactly why I know for a fact that this is a concern that will be thought about in your case. So here's the instructions that I'm sure you've all read. I'm sure everybody's read this, right? And it goes through all the normal stuff about how to fill in the form, etc. And then if you've been paying attention, many people don't, there is a frequently asked questions section on this form, okay? And all the way down at the end of this form, if I go through, it's usually question number 37 or 38. Here we go, miscellaneous, 38 in this year. If I receive a visa through the DV program, will the US government pay for airfare to the United States, help me find housing and employment, and provide healthcare or any other subsidies until I'm fully settled? No. Let's just be clear, none of that's going to happen. They give you the green card, you arrive at the airport, and you're on your own. You've got to make your own way in life. America is not going to make it easy for you. It's an opportunity, it's not a gift. Okay. Now, in this section, though, it says you've got to provide, you must demonstrate that you will not become a public charge in the United States before being issued a visa, and the evidence may be in the form of a combination of personal assets, as I mentioned earlier, an affidavit of support, Form I-134, submitted by a relative or friend residing in the United States, an offer of employment by an employer in the United States, or other evidence. Forget the other evidence, that's basically it. So they're the three things that I've told you, personal assets, personal savings, the I-134, or the job offer. That's essentially it, right? So please don't tell me that you weren't told about this. You were told about this if you bothered to read the instructions. And please, there's no point arguing with me about whether this is really a part of it, because your brother, sister, uncle wasn't asked for it 7 years ago when they got their DV lottery case. I don't care. The reality is this is a part of the process. How it's administered case by case, CO by CO, embassy by embassy will vary, but I can tell you things are tightening. So, for example, in Nepal, at Kathmandu embassy, over the last few years, up until about a year ago, applicants were just asked for a welcome letter, as they talked about that, a letter from someone in the USA inviting them to the USA, essentially making a promise to be their host. And but more recently, this year, I've noticed more and more cases are being asked for the I-134. Similarly, in Africa, the host system was in place where simply mentioning that you were going to be hosted by a family or someone in the USA was enough. But again, they're tightening up on this, so this is a concern. Okay. So let me now transfer over to the form itself, and I'll explain how this can be filled out. Okay, just before I open the form itself, let me show you here. The federal poverty guidelines are published and updated every year, and you can just Google federal poverty guidelines. This is one source. This is the household family size I mentioned earlier. So I gave an example of a sponsor with a family of 4, husband, wife, and 2 children, right? And your own family is, for example, in this example, 3 people. Husband, wife, and a child, right? So the sponsor's income in that case would need to be more than $38,060 a year at 100% of federal poverty guidelines. This mentions the 48 continental US states. There's a separate amount for Alaska and a separate amount for Hawaii, but frankly you can ignore those two. You can use these 48 states numbers as the place that you'd be using, unless specifically you're planning to emigrate to Hawaii, but it would be based on the sponsor's income, right? So so forget those Alaska and Hawaii numbers. Generally speaking, you want to be looking in the 100% column against the combined household or family size. These numbers, by the way, are extremely low. If somebody already has, if somebody's supporting their own family, a family of 4, let's say, and they and they're only earning 25,000 a year, frankly, that's not a lot of money. It might sound a lot to some countries, but it's not a lot of money. So if somebody isn't meeting these sort of guidelines, then frankly, they're in no position to be supporting you. So, there you go. The absolute minimum that in terms of household size would be one single applicant, yourself, and a sponsor who's a single person. So that would mean a minimum income of 16,000. This is, that's an annual amount. I mean, I think, I pay my gardener and cleaner probably about that sort of money. So, it's not a lot of money at all. So, please do think about that. All right, so let's look at the form. So you can Google I-134 to get this form. You can find information about public charge. It's on USCIS website here, etc. But here's the actual form. There's instructions for the form, and there's the form itself. Okay, so we'll have a look at the form itself. This is the form. And it's, I think, an 8-page. Yes, it's an 8-page form. People worry about this expires date, by the way. This date is simply a date when the form itself should be renewed. It's got nothing to do with your case. But if you go to the official link that I just showed you for the I-134, you will get the current form. Okay. So, so this is the form. The sponsor would fill this out. They can type it or they can print it in black ink. Either way, it doesn't have to be typed. It doesn't have, either way, right? So they fill in the family name and other names that they've used. The sponsor's address, right? The country, etc. Is your mailing and physical address the same? All of that's very normal. Somebody should be able to fill that out. There's another address thing here. If you've chosen no, right, then you fill in this section. Other information, the date of birth of the sponsor. This is all still about the sponsor, right? And the alien registration number of the sponsor, if there is one, social security number, all of this information needs to be filled out. If the sponsor is not prepared to give you this information to present at the interview, then frankly that sponsor is no good to you. They're supposed to be a close friend or a family member. They should be happy to give you this information. There's no concern about that if they trust you. If they're not prepared to give you the form because they consider this information private, then frankly they don't care enough about you. And that's going to be the first thought that pops into the CO's mind when you say, well, my sponsor didn't want me to have the form. So forget all that nonsense about, my sponsor's sending this form straight to the embassy because he doesn't want me to see it. Nonsense. He or she either sends the form to you with the supporting information, otherwise it's not a proper sponsor. Okay, so all right, that's page 1. Page 2 is again continuing information about the sponsor there, and then it comes onto the information about you. I'm assuming you are the beneficiary because you are the principal selectee. So the name of the principal selectee would be entered here, right? And the date of birth of the principal. The A number. You don't have an A number yet unless you've previously had, an immigrant case with USIS. So generally you won't have that. Your country of citizenship or nationality, your marital status, and the relationship to the sponsor. So the sponsor is filling out this form, and the sponsor is going to say here what the relationship is. It should say, brother-in-law or close family friend or something like that. But again, although this form is not legally enforceable financially, the sponsor cannot commit perjury on this form. That would be a serious crime. So the relationship sponsor has to be accurate and real. And they will ask you questions. They will ask you about this sponsor. They'll ask you to they'll ask you probing questions about who the sponsor is. And if your answers are not good, then they're going to ask more and more and more. And eventually they'll realize that you're just making up this relationship. And the sponsor and yourself will both be in trouble. Beneficiary's physical address, that's your home address. And then your spouse here and your children, right? That's all to go on that form, right? Now it has space for 2 children there, and it says here if you need additional space, there's space provided in Part 7 additional information. Okay, so if you've got more children than 2, that's going to be added in later on. All right, other information about the sponsor. This gives job information about the employer, the income information, savings, and that sort of thing. Now, this form is measured mainly by income, not by assets. So if, for example, the person's income is low, but they have $100,000 in savings, the sponsor we're talking about, that might sound like a lot of money, but for purposes of evaluation of this form, they divide that number for savings by 5. So in other words, $100,000 is only $20,000 in terms of income. Income is far more powerful as far as this form is concerned than savings. Okay, so income is the most important thing. For that reason, you shouldn't be using a sponsor who is, perhaps retired, unemployed, anything like that. They have to have income, even if they have some sort of, decent amount of savings. Okay. Then some other information about their assets, although, as I say, the assets won't be valued very much. They'll be valued at 1/5 of their actual value. Some information about the real estate. This basically will be the home address and the home property of the person that is the sponsor, if that is owned. So if somebody's got $1 million house and only a $500,000 mortgage, then those two numbers would go in here, and it tends to show they've got some money, but it's tied up in a house. So that's not very useful. Then dependence information here is dependence of the sponsor. And there are a number of boxes here. They can enter 1, 2, oh, I went too far. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, I think there's 4 or 5 dependents, maybe 6 here. So they are required to list all of their dependents. That's, the spouse and any children. Then at the end here, there's a box that says, I intend on or do not intend to make specific contributions in support of the person named in Part 2. In other words, you. The person should select intend. I intend to make specific contributions, and should list something like the exact nature and duration of the contributions that are intended to make up the support. Ideally, it should be something without financial limit and without time period. So in other words, someone could say, I intend to support someone with room and board for as long as necessary. Okay, so that's not limited by time. That's better than saying room and board for 6 months. Or room and board, which is not measured, it's just, financial assistance, is better than saying I'm going to provide someone with $100, right? So saying $100 a week for 6 months is not good. Saying as much money as they need, or as much support as they need, or room and board for as long as they need is a much more powerful statement. Okay. Then there are, this is the bit where they sign under perjury rules, right? And there's some information here. Let's see if I can see the perjury bit. Can't see it there, but I know this is there is a promise. There you go. I certify under penalty of perjury. And perjury is a serious crime in America. You don't want to be caught lying. So any information in this form provided by the sponsor has to be truthful. Okay, and the sponsor will sign this form there. At the end of this, there's an interpreter's information. If an interpreter is used, typically wouldn't be, and a preparer's information. So that doesn't need to be provided. If it says what to do here, there's no need to ask me questions about this really. The form is extremely simple and very well documented, and there are also supporting instructions. But anyway, here's the form, and then final couple of pages. Contact information for the preparer if there were one, and a couple of boxes here. Any preparer should be able to should be able to figure out how to answer those questions. And then finally, the additional information page, which is where you would add, for example, additional children and that sort of thing that couldn't fit on the form in earlier questions. So they number here 5A, 6A, 6D, etc. They number those so it ties up to the information, so it's clear whether it's the sponsor's child or whether it's your child, for example. Okay, so that's the form, 8 pages, either typed or in black ink. Okay. Then scanned, sent to you. You take it to the interview. The best time to get that, of course, is after the 2NL and before the interview. You should get that, okay, and take it to the interview. People ask me, what do I do? I don't know anyone in America. Well, everybody kind of knows everybody everyone knows somebody in America. That's the first thing I would say. If you really can't find someone who can give you an I-134, then you're going to have to show savings. If you don't want to show savings or a job offer or an I-134, then you're taking a risk with your case. So you need to figure this out. You may not be asked about finances, but you may be. And if you are, your case cannot be approved until you've answered that question to the satisfaction of the CO and provided evidence with whatever they ask for. Okay, so sorry for a long video, but this is certainly worth you understanding this topic. I think I've covered it fairly well, and hopefully this has been interesting and worthwhile for you. If you like this video, please let me know, give me a thumbs up, let me know you liked it. If you want more information like this, please subscribe to the channel. Make sure you get the latest information as soon as I can publish it. I'm working through the frequently asked questions from my blog, so I'll be providing those questions in video format over the coming weeks, and I'll continue to share information as I get it on the current DV 2020 and beyond. Okay, everybody, have a great day, have a great week. Hope everything's good with you. Bye-bye.